Whew. Oh, wow. After a long day of school, I sure can't wait to kick back and unwind and smoke this cigarette like all the cool kids. Wait, Fraud, put the death sticks down, son. God? Don't you know drugs are bad? Just because all the cool kids are doing it doesn't mean you need to. That's what we call peer pressure. Wow, you're right, me from the future. Peer pressure is lame. I'm done with drugs. Yes, today we are taking a look at a program taught to millions of American children. A program that somehow manipulated school children into snitching on their parents.
What?
Ladies and gentlemen, I give to you the one, the only D.a.r.e. D.a.r.e. or the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program was, if anything, a key and unforgettable part of an American childhood from the years 1983 all the way up into the mid-2000s. The idea for D.a.r.e., this program, was pretty simple and basic: to equip elementary school children with the skills for resisting peer pressure to experiment with tobacco, drugs, and alcohol. Basically, their idea was to provide this education as an intention to reduce the demand for drugs through education that would make drug use unappealing, unpopular to an up-and-coming younger generation. So obviously, if you are an American of a certain age, you're probably at least somewhat familiar with the D.a.r.e. program. There's a man cutting grass right outside my window. I remember it like it was yesterday. It seemed like at least 3 or 4 times a year at my middle school, there would be a big assembly meeting for D.a.r.e. Our whole middle school would be taken into our auditorium kind of building area and be forced to sit through all of these different lectures from police officers and experts on how to avoid peer pressure and drug use. Of course, 10-year-old me at this time had zero idea on what drugs even were. I barely had a concept on even what alcohol was. So in kind of a way, I feel like the D.a.r.e. program almost had the complete opposite effect on me. Basically, this program focused around mainly lectures from police officers on the harmful use of drug and alcohol use in an attempt to teach young children, young little babby students, on how to avoid peer pressure and the danger of drugs. They even had this diploma thing they would hand out whenever you graduated from the program. Basically, I guess whenever you were going to high school. Of course, I was sick that day in 8th grade, so I never got my diploma. While as a broad concept, D.a.r.e. was a good idea in theory. I don't think there's anything wrong with educating children about the dangers of drug and alcohol use, as well as how to combat peer pressure, something that we as kids and even young adults consistently go to probably till the end of time. However, though, while a good idea in theory, D.a.r.e. would have a number of issues that slowly became evident through its 30-ish plus years of practice. Among those issues, probably the one that's most prevalent, the most, fucked up, if you will, was the turning of middle school children into undercover agents like Leonardo DiCaprio in The Departed. But instead of snitching on criminal organizations and mafia groups, these children would be snitching on their own parents. Okay, to better understand D.a.r.e. and how we got to this point, we need to take our minds back to the 1980s. Ronald Reagan is president. It's the height of the Cold War and the beginning of the 1980s, which would begin to see the decline of the hippie free love movements of the 1960s and 70s. Drug use was on the rise in America, and President Ronald Reagan decided to take it upon himself to fight this crisis, as the war on drugs, which was started under President Nixon, would massively be expanded under Ronald Reagan. From 1980 to 1984, the federal annual budget of the FBI, Drug Enforcement Unit, went from $8 million to $95 million. As well, in 1984, Ronald Reagan signed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, an act which expanded penalties towards possessions of cannabis, of marijuana, and established a federal system of mandatory minimum sentences and established procedures for civil asset forfeiture, which is simply just fancy speak for, we're gonna take all your stuff. Wow, geez, thanks Mr. Reagan for lumping together all those non-violent drug offenders with the violent ones. Originally developed by Daryl Gates, chief of the LA Police Department in 1983 in collaboration with the local LA school districts. By 1988, D.a.r.e. had spread rapidly across the country and was in nearly 75% of American schools. Ronald Reagan later that year declaring the first National D.a.r.e. Day. As well, the program began to receive funding from our federal government. By 2002, the D.a.r.e. program's budget would exceed over $10 million. As I said before, the program primarily consisted of lectures and lessons taught by police officers. At my school, we even had a defense attorney come to us and talk about the seriousness of drug crimes, this defense attorney being a parent of one of my friends that I grew up with. Of course, the main teachers in these lessons plans were police officers, or better known probably as D.a.r.e. officers. The officers teaching the dangers of drugs and attempting to build a relationship with these kids in order to encourage kids to come forward about drug use through the use of D.a.r.e. boxes. Basically, these were like anonymous boxes that you could submit like an anonymous tip saying like, oh, yes, little Billy over there was doing drugs. Or I saw Fraud smoking a joint behind the bleachers. Put the camera down. For me, though, as a young lad, really the only thing that got me to pay attention at all during these D.a.r.e. assemblies was their hilarious promo videos. Okay, so it's likely that if you're watching this video, you probably knew most of this. It's probably likely that you actually were a D.a.r.e. kid yourself, like me. Or it's possible that you've watched one of the many YouTube videos out there about D.a.r.e. as a program. Personally, I recommend the Eddie B video. But what you might not have known was how these D.a.r.e. officers were straight up turning middle school children into snitches and criminal informants. Not just on their fellow classmates, but on their freaking parents. Recently, I stumbled across this Slate article titled "The D.a.r.e. Snitches." The article details multiple accounts and stories of the D.a.r.e. program convincing children across America to get their parents locked up. A lot of times during the D.a.r.e. program, children would be asked to submit oftentimes rather sensitive questionnaires about certain events going on with their home and their parents to their D.a.r.e. police officers. The D.a.r.e. officers teaching the important lessons of the 3 R's: recognize, resist, report. Basically, in trying to encourage these children to tell the police or their teachers if they find any drugs at home or if their friends are doing any drugs. Now, right now, you might be saying to yourself, come on, Fraud, surely no kids out there actually reported their parents to the D.a.r.e. cops for having drugs. I give to you 11-year-old Crystal Grindle. Flash your mind back to April 1991 when a young Crystal Grindle was summoned to her school counselor's office. Here she was asked by her school counselor if her parents used drugs. Now, it's likely that there was some peer pressure, a little bit of pressure from this school counselor to get Crystal to talk about her parents' potentially illicit activities, but at the end of the conversation, Crystal would eventually say that yes, her parents every once in a while did smoke marijuana. Over the next few days, the counselor would inquire multiple times as to how Crystal was doing in her home and suggested to Crystal that she tell the police or at the very least the school's D.a.r.e. officer. The following days, young Crystal was put in touch with the school's local D.a.r.e. officer, Officer Gilway, along with 2 other officers, which came to the school to interrogate Crystal about her parents' drugs habits. According to the Slate article, the officer told her that if she cooperated by informing them of her parents' drug habits, there would be no consequences. Yeah, that was a fucking lie. According to Crystal, the officer told her that if she did not cooperate by snitching out her parents' use of marijuana, both Crystal, who is 11 by the way, and her parents would be in a lot of trouble. Officer Gilway would conclude this meeting with Crystal by telling her a warning, basically saying that oftentimes parents would beat their children after they spoke to the police, so she probably shouldn't tell their parents. What? Now, if that's just not straight up manipulating an 11-year-old, then I don't know what the fuck is. That afternoon, police would raid her home, arresting both of her parents and taking Crystal and her younger sister to a distant relative. The incident would ultimately lead to a civil suit against these police officers in the police department, the court ultimately ruling in favor for Crystal and her family, the judge admonishing the police saying, and I quote, "The officer's coercive extraction of indicting information from an 11-year-old girl about her parents was shocking to the conscious and unworthy of constitutional protection." Holy based. Of course, law enforcement officials across the country didn't really see much of a problem with these types of practices. Sergeant Robert Gates, an administrative officer with D.a.r.e. America, said at the time to a reporter following this incident that arresting drug-using parents was a positive outcome. And I quote, "My personal opinion is that an arrest is the best thing that could have ever happened to that parent," referring to Crystal's case. Marijuana could lead to harder drugs, which in turn could ultimately lead to death. What may turn out to be negative for the parents is a positive for society. Now, Crystal's story is just one example of many in said article. For example, in Caroline County, Maryland, for instance, a mother and a father spent 30 days in jail after their daughter informed her D.a.r.e. officer that her parents had a marijuana plant in their home. In another instance, in Englewood, Colorado, a student called 911 when he found marijuana in a bookshelf at his home, the child proudly announcing to the 911 operator, "I'm a D.a.r.e. kid." This even consisted into the mid-2000s, as there is a report of an 11-year-old D.a.r.e. student in North Carolina supposedly reporting on his parents' marijuana use that year, even bringing a joint to school as proof. Following a D.a.r.e. lesson, police would arrest the child's parents and social services would remove the kid and his siblings from the home. Now, I feel like I don't really need to explain why this is a bad thing. Obviously, I'm not condoning irresponsible drug and alcohol use as a parent. Like, it would be one thing if these parents were like complete strung out addicts and just horrible people, but in reality, it just seems like they like to have a little puff of the green every once in a while. Of course, this is also hilarious and ironic, as the state which saw the birth of D.a.r.e., California, in 1983, like 13 years later, would be the first state in the United States to medically legalize marijuana. The funny thing is, despite all of this and 30 plus years in service, D.a.r.e. wasn't working. It wasn't doing anything. If anything, it seemed like possibly D.a.r.e. might have done the opposite, driving more young students to drug use than preventing it. After many years of D.a.r.e., parents began to grow wary, and by the mid-90s, there was a plethora of studies that began to emerge concluding that yes, D.a.r.e. in fact did little to nothing to prevent students from using drugs and alcohol, and there was even one study which seemed to suggest that D.a.r.e. students were more likely than non-D.a.r.e. students to use drug and alcohol. Now, obviously, this is a lot more complicated than all of this. The 90s were like a real time of counterculture. The 90s saw the rise of punk, grunge, and rap music, just to name a few examples of how society was beginning to push back on what we were being told was okay. Of course, politicians and police officers everywhere ignored all of this evidence, and D.a.r.e. chugged along for another 20 plus years, the program slowly losing funding until finally in 2009, D.a.r.e.'s program would change, rebranding itself to Keeping It Real, a lesson plan that focuses less on drug prevention and more on good decision-making skills in general.
I'm Officer Craig Seibel with the Salem Police Department, and we are keeping it real.
All in all, D.a.r.e. was basically a complete waste of time and money. Not only did it not do what it actually said it set out to do, and potentially actually did the opposite, making the problem even worse. Basically, at this point now, D.a.r.e. has become a complete meme, and its logos and shirts are almost more associated with drug use and counterculture than drug prevention. At this point, seeing a D.a.r.e. shirt is basically like a beacon that says, "Hey, I smoke weed." Obviously, even more insane, though, is the fact that the D.a.r.e. program managed to turn kids all across the United States into snitches and criminal informants by lying to them, manipulating them, all so they can just lock up these kids' parents. Oopsie, we accidentally created a broken household and now you don't have parents to raise you. Sorry about that. I mean, come on, how come people don't just do what my dad did when he found me with a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of whiskey? "Now, son, I'm gonna need you to smoke all these here cigarettes." Hey guys, if you enjoyed the video, learn something new, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, as it really does help the channel out. Links to the Slate article are in the description down below. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. Drink your water, hug your mother. Until next time, peace, love, adu.